Please welcome back Charles Duhigg and guests Eric Klinenberg and Peter Madonia.
It's been so long. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that. I feel like this is the perfect conversation to follow up on the conversation with Governor Hickenlooper. For Eric, you are a professor of sociology at N.Y.U. You've studied extensively how cities and communities come together around disasters, around opportunities. Peter, you were the chief operating officer or you're currently the chief operating officer for the Rockefeller Foundation. You were chief of staff to Mayor Bloomberg, and before that were involved in many parts of New York City government. And what I was hoping to talk about a little bit today is, how do we think about cities as organisms? How do we think about communities apart from just the individuals who live in them as these collective wholes? And I wanted to start, if I could, Peter, tell me, when we were talking on the phone, we talked a little bit about the blackout of 1977 versus the blackout of 2004, which you were in the control room during 2004. Set the stage for me for what New York is like in 1977 before the lights go out.
Sure, thank you. I'm curious, how many people were here in 1977 in July? Not a lot. So there's not a lot of memory. But a lot of things had built up to the city psyche by the time we got to July of 1977. The city was on the verge of bankruptcy, and what that meant was, in order to become solvent, it had to get loan guarantees. In order to get the loan guarantees, it had to dramatically slash services, and I mean the most essential services: police, fire, and sanitation, the things that affect the public on a daily basis. When I was in City Hall in the 1980s, we had about 22,000 cops. When I went back in 2004, we had close to 40,000. Dramatic difference. What Mayor Lindsay dubbed as Fun City and the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the 60s turned into a heroin epidemic in the 70s. City neighborhoods, not just poor neighborhoods, were beset with young people who were addicted to heroin, disrupted families, disrupted communities, disrupted the social fabric that was part of people's lives. Beam was probably a wonderful accountant, but he was a very uncharismatic mayor. And there's a great PBS special on the 77 blackout where they interview him the night of the blackout when it was absolute chaos here. And he was like a deer in the headlights. And that is a moment when a mayor has to take a leadership role and reassure the city best you can, or lead it through whatever is happening, much the way the Giuliani administration did after 9/11. And I think Mike did post 9/11 when we faced other issues. We had gone through unplanned housing and school desegregation. Middle class flight started to happen. The city lost 800,000 or more people in the 70s. With that came the housing stock started to get abandoned. Landlords started to use fire as a way to collect insurance. By the time we got to the 80s, the city was the landlord of last resort, and either 100,000 housing units were either abandoned or being run by the city. The city is not a very good landlord. And there were several, I think, crippling infrastructure decisions. One that I thought was truly devastating was the building of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which cut right through the heart of the entire borough, the southern part of the borough, disrupted families, disrupted neighborhoods, split neighborhoods in half, and again, was completely disruptive to social cohesion and the social fabric of the people who live there. And then decisions made about not investing in the transit infrastructure. If the city has a psyche, transit is the bloodstream, the city's subway system. And the disinvestment that occurred there led to multiple derailments a day. By the time we got to the 80s, a system that was graffiti covered when graffiti wasn't art, and a system that was unsafe. So those are, to me, and there are others, but those were the key component things that led up to the night of July 11th, I believe, in 1977, which I experienced as a 23-year-old. And the city was brought to its knees in certain parts of it, certainly in the Bronx and in Brooklyn.
And did you, on that night, there's been a lot of writing about that night, that Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning by one of my colleagues sort of captures it dramatically. what was it like? I mean, when you were, did you feel scared that night?
Yes. I mean, I was scared for the city. Cities are resilient, but they're also fragile. So I was scared at that level. I grew up in a neighborhood, and my family owns a business in a small, what then was almost entirely Italian-American, Italian immigrant conclave up in the Bronx. That was on the northern end of the South Bronx, just south of Fordham Road. And it was an incredibly cohesive community. If I'm not mistaken, the Times actually wrote a story in the 80s that it was the safest neighborhood in America. But it was because everybody knew everybody. So that night, everybody was out on the street watching each other, the businesses, the homes, but almost everything around it burnt.
So we fast forward to 2004, your chief of staff, Mike Bloomberg, we have the exact same event occur, same blackout, completely different response from the city. Why?
So I think a series of things that happened over the next 25 years, and nobody called them building resilience, but at the end of the day, they are, as you think about them, they are things that built a more resilient city. First of all, we had an incredibly charismatic mayor, and somebody who was a cheerleader. In the worst of times, Ed Koch was out on the street and asking people, how am I doing? And it was, people got to know their mayor, got to feel like he was in charge. And he did lead the city through the bankruptcy, but not alone. I mean, the difference between what happened leading up to 77 and what happened leading up to 2004 is, the business community stepped up. David Rockefeller started the New York City Partnership then. The Association for a Better New York was created. People started to have forums for other than government to care about and participate in what was happening in the city. And then we had an incredibly strong labor leaders. Victor Gottbaum stepped up to the plate in order to restore the services that had to happen in order for the city to recover and recuperate. Labor had to be part of that. And Victor Gottbaum with David Rockefeller, Ed Koch, there were some genuinely strong leaders and charismatic ones that pushed forward together to take the city out of bankruptcy. Once it achieves fiscal solvency, that's when it started to rebuild the services. Reopening firehouses, adding police officers, paying the workers more, getting more productivity out of them. And then Ed Koch put together the 10-year housing plan that started the re-entry of what was in-rem housing or city-owned housing into the private sector's hands, who know how to do it better. As neighborhoods started to rebuild back, jobs started to come back, and we get to 9/11. David Dinkins put Safe Streets, Safe Cities in to start to add more police officers. Rudy Giuliani manages, I think, whatever anyone thinks of Rudy Giuliani, a wonderful job managing the city through 9/11, getting that site back in order, getting the city back to some calm. And then when Mike took over Bloomberg, it was really now dealing with the fallout of 9/11, which was a $7 billion budget deficit.
So let me ask something, and Eric, let me ask you. So it sounds like, if I'm sort of interpreting what you're saying, up to 1977, we have a story that New York is telling itself of decline. Up to 2004, we have a story of rebirth and regrowth, coming out of 2001 and feeling like we're coming together as a city. Now, Eric, when you looked at the Chicago heat wave, you weren't looking at an entire city. You were looking at communities, and you were asking, why did people who were at risk in that heat wave die? Why did some communities save lives? Why did neighboring communities that looked exactly the same let people die or help contribute to deaths?
Right.
The same question on kind of a macro level or micro level. What's the difference there?
Well, the truth is, when I wrote the book about the heat wave, I looked both at Chicago as a total system and then also more granularly at what made neighborhoods have such different experiences with this event. And I want to say very quickly, I think one takeaway I get from your story about the two New Yorks is that the everyday conditions that we experience in cities structure or determine our extreme events as well. So what happens in a disaster is very much a reflection of underlying social conditions that we sometimes take for granted. So it's not just about leadership, it's not just about emergency response. Resilience is very much organized around our everyday lives. right? And that really matters. Now, that was true in Chicago as well. Chicago is a grossly unequal city. Chicago is a city where there were real political leadership problems, particularly around dealing with inequality and violence. That was true in 1995, just as it's true today. And this extraordinary heat wave hit the city in July of 1995. The temperature hit about 106 degrees. The heat index, which is what a typical person experiences, hit 126, and it stayed like that for a couple days. We react very strongly to hurricanes and tornadoes, floods. They're very visible events. They generate property damage. We depict them on television in spectacular fashion. Heat waves are really invisible disasters, and they tend to pinpoint invisible people and places, very old people, very poor people, people who are shut-ins. And more than 700 people died after just a few days in this crisis. Now, it's completely clear that the people in Chicago who suffered the most were disadvantaged. They were older, they were poor, they were frail, more African American, but you don't win a Nobel Prize in social science for coming up with that finding, right? That's something we all know and expect about the world. So what really interested me in my research was trying to break down why it was that neighborhoods that looked very similar on paper, places that were very poor, that were very segregated, that had high levels of violence, why did they have such disparate experiences during this event? And what I discovered from this research is that the conditions of places that did well were very similar. They had a pretty robust social infrastructure. Conditions for everyday life, despite poverty, encouraged social interactions. They had viable sidewalks. They had commercial outlets that drew people, including older people, out of their homes and into social contact. Whereas the places in the city that had the highest death rates, regardless of race or ethnicity, were places that had been depleted. They had had massive population loss. They had lost their commercial infrastructure, degraded public spaces. And these are parts of the city that really discourage social contact. I think those were the parts of New York City that were most likely to burn in 1977. They're the parts of Chicago that were most likely to fry in 1995. And all of that tells us that the conversation about resilience has to be much more robust than just a conversation about what leadership can do when disaster strikes.
So let me ask something on that, because one of the goals of this panel is to talk about this question, and particularly in an age of anxiety. For folks in the audience, how many of you feel like your city, the city that you're working with or living within, is more anxious today than it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago? A good number of folks. And I think particularly given the last couple of months, right? We've seen assassinations of police officers, we've seen mass uprisings, we've seen an African American population that seems that for the first time is vocalizing and filming a fear of police officers in a way that's really tangible. So if rather than looking for these specific events like a heat wave or a blackout, if we're looking at our cities right now as something that is living through a crisis, what do we know about how we can help citizens find resiliency, become stronger, so that we have 2004 instead of 1977, so that we're in one of those good neighborhoods in 1995 in Chicago rather than one of the bad ones?
Well, the first thing I would say is we're at this completely striking moment in our urban experience, because we are actually far safer in most American cities than we have been in decades. If anything, we are living through a kind of peace dividend right now that we're getting from the transformation of urban street life. It is exponentially more safe to be in New York City than it was 30 years ago, and that's certainly true of Chicago, but we don't experience it that way.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why then do people feel more anxious? Because I think we saw a lot of hands, and I think this is true. We know from polls that people are more anxious now.
Well, I think there are many reasons to feel insecure. The things are happening that we have not experienced before that make us uneasy. We certainly cover violence as if in the media, as if there's a dramatic spike. I've read with great interest the Times' coverage of violence in Chicago, which is my native city, and noted that while all of that was true, it was even more true several decades ago when we didn't cover it. I mean, it's so fascinating. I was a child growing up in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s, and at 2:30 or 3 o'clock every day, my friends and I, starting at the age of about 8, would walk through the most urban neighborhoods you could find on our own, not without cell phones, not be discovered by our parents for many hours when we would show up for dinner. No one had any idea where we were. That was a fine thing to do. My children now live in a dramatically safer environment here in Manhattan, and if I let them do that, I would be in jail. Right? So there's something about our feeling about what's happening in the world that makes us uncomfortable. I think there are many drivers of it. The media is part of it, but also, of course, we're concerned about this week it's violence with the police and distrust. It's also concerns about terrorism and random acts of violence. There's no shortage of things to be worried about, but I have to say that objectively speaking, we are much safer than we've been in a long time.
And Peter, let me ask you about something. We talked about Ebola when we were chatting earlier, the difference between how New York responded and other cities responded. Odds are that no one in this room is going to get Ebola in their lifetime. We've all heard about Ebola and Zika much more than the many other diseases that we will get. Better odds that one of us is going to get cancer and die from heart disease than one of those Ebola or Zika. But why do you think New York's response and other cities was so different? How does it influence the population?
So the city's health commissioner by charter has to be a doctor. And I've always thought about the health commissioner as the doctor for the public in New York. It's as if it's your personal doctor, only it's on a citywide basis. And what I thought Dr. Mary Bassett did that was wonderful is she came out and talked about the science. And having a medical professional, not the mayor. Mayor's an adjunct to that conversation and has other roles as it relates to reassuring the public. But the medical doctor was up front talking about what Ebola is and what it isn't, what we should worry about, what we should not worry about, what we should do and what we shouldn't do or don't need to do. And that provides the public with a sense of confidence about how they should feel as a city about what's happening with Ebola. The mayor then needs to take that and extrapolate it and expand on it in terms of the actions the city is taking. But from a pure science and medical professional perspective, the city needs to hear from its professional. And so the charter and the creators of the charter were very smart in putting that requirement for the city's public health official. And I think that is what reassures the psyche of the public, that they don't need to be anxious beyond a certain level about Ebola. I don't think it was done quite as well with Legionnaires. I think there was a real overreaction in the city to what scientifically exists all the time and you cannot eradicate. It's how do you prevent it?
This was the outbreak last year,
yeah.
Legionnaires' outbreak last year. Okay, so let me ask this question, because I think this is something a lot of people in this audience are confronting. If you were the mayor of a city that is experiencing this spasm of riots, perhaps you've had some police officers that have been shot, perhaps you've had some filmed encounters between African American drivers and police officers. We know, to your point, that this is a small sample of what's happening in that city. But for the populations who are involved in it, the populations who identify, the fact that it's infrequent or small outweighs the statistical probability. How do you talk to that city to bring down the anxiety of an organism that's 500,000 people?
You taking this one? Look, mayors can never communicate enough at the grassroots level, and that is when the mayor has to really get out on the street. And that is why, much as most mayors hate them, they'll never admit it, they do town hall meetings. It's where you go to the community leaders, the religious leadership in any community, and you can't talk enough about what the facts are, and what you're doing to address whatever the anxiety is. In this instance, it's police community relations. And then you do have to start thinking about how are we spending our money and what are we putting in place to address this. But you can't talk about it enough when anxieties are high.
But let me challenge you a little bit on this, because Mike Bloomberg, billionaire, not necessarily someone who, for those of us who spent time with him, you would call a man of the people naturally. Bill DeBlasio comes from a grassroots background. I don't think either of them would ever say, no, as a matter of policy, I try not to talk to the people, right? Everyone would say the exact same thing you said, and yet such different outcomes between these two men. What did they do differently that explains why Bloomberg was kind of successful at this and DeBlasio is struggling with it right now?
I'm not answering that question.
Well, let's face it. Also, the times are different as well, and there are explosive events that we're experiencing over the last couple of years that were very different under Bloomberg. And I think one of the things we've seen under DeBlasio is a real effort to deal with heavy-handed, often discriminatory practices of the New York City Police Department in neighborhoods where stop and frisk became a real public health crisis and a crisis for young people of color. And that was a serious issue in New York City. There were serious issues of New York City that emerged under Bloomberg that DeBlasio has tried to address. Obviously, Bloomberg inherited difficult issues as well. So I think we're now in a different moment. And the one thing I'd caution us on here, and I think it's important especially to say this in a journalistic organization, even one as responsible as the New York Times, and it really is that I wouldn't quite say that we're experiencing spasms of riots at the moment in the United States. In fact, what's extraordinary to me is the level of civility that we maintain given the kinds of inequalities and the very heated, if not violent, political rhetoric that we're getting from at least one of the political parties right now. I mean, these are potentially tumultuous times, and it's extraordinary to think about the level of civil order that we maintain. Now, conversely, I know we're running short on time, and one of the things that we've talked about is a very different kind of threat around which many of the experts think there should be maybe more anxiety and concern, and confoundingly there's less of that in the general public, and that's climate change. And what you probably noticed that last night the Republican National Convention focused on safety in America. I was very excited because I thought that was going to be all about climate change, but turned out I was wrong about that. I didn't hear much discussion of that last night. But New York City, especially, I think, in the wake of Sandy, has really been trying to deal with this new threat. And interestingly, I think the psyche here has transformed, certainly in philanthropic circles and government circles, because we're all now much more aware of the precariousness of our city in the face of the kind of extreme weather that will come. And so here we need to do a few things, one of which is think about the kind of neighborhood social ties and civic engagement, because when systems break down, it's your relationship with your neighbors that's going to make the difference between life and death. It's how well the community organizations operate where you live that will make the difference between life and death. So we also need to think about engineering really different kinds of systems and really rebuilding our infrastructure to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And these are areas that I think are frontier issues. Maybe we'll talk more at a future cities conference. And we can't get away from those no matter what we do.
Absolutely. Let's go to some questions. If you have a question, feel free to send it to Q at N.Y. Times or, sir, right up here, if you want to get a mic down.
Eric or Peter, I'm following very closely the 100 resilient cities, and I just wondered, you just mentioned money and infrastructure. Where's the money coming from, public-private partnerships, or how do you rank that as a priority? Because when transportation goes down, certainly in a major city, we know that the anxiety goes straight up. And I've lived in both San Francisco and New York, and they're both going through cross-town, cross-Bronx kinds of mentalities with either the extension of BART or what's going on with the 2nd Avenue subway or 7th Avenue, just walking over here this morning.
I mean, I'll let Eric back me up on this, but look, cities are going to spend money on infrastructure. The question is, how are you spending it? Is the transportation department worried about just building a road, or is somebody thinking about, if we build that road, can we connect communities that aren't connected? Can we add public space to it? Can we make it infrastructure strong against storms and other shocks? That to me is it's spending money smartly through a resilience lens.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, our networks for transit, for communications, for energy will have to dramatically transform in coming decades, given sea level rise and just given the fact that they're aging. Everyone here has probably had the experience of coming from a country that seems developing by comparison, arriving in New York City and thinking you've just gone back a century infrastructure-wise. We're woefully behind. The longer we wait to do this, the more expensive it will be and the more cost we'll have in our daily lives from all these inconveniences. I think we need to have federal leadership on this. I think cities don't have enough money for it, and it's inevitable that this will happen. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how, because it's a big puzzle.
And we also believe that if with a slightly broader perspective and maybe a little more investment, there's a dividend to be had in what you save when the catastrophe hits in relief and recovery.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. I'm based in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is currently sort of a booming city with a massive homeless problem. We have an estimated 43,000 plus homeless. We have people living in tents under nearly every freeway underpass, but also on the streets in downtown and communities like that. New York, it seems, has made major strides in that regard, and I'm curious whether any of you have thoughts on dealing with this kind of problem.
I actually would argue, and I hold myself as much accountable as anybody, that we have not made major strides. So when I was in City Hall in the 80s, and I was a mere child at the time, it really was the advent of the homeless crisis. The advocates were arguing there were 30,000 homeless people on the streets of New York. The city of New York was arguing the opposite. They were right, we were wrong. I don't know if it was 36,000, but it was way more than we were admitting. We went into reactive mode because we hadn't thought about it, and we were, really not looking ourselves in the mirror, quite frankly. And so what's been built is a system of shelters. There's the city's spending over $1 billion a year on shelters. That to me is not a real solution. I think back on, I mentioned earlier, there were 100,000 units of housing that were in the city's, on the city's rolls. We never really contemplated in the 80s connecting those 100,000 units to the fact that we had a homeless problem. And even if you took 10% of them, 10,000 units would have gone a long way towards affordable housing for people who were otherwise homeless. So it's an oversimplification, but I would argue New York has not solved this problem. We've managed it because we have the money to manage it, but spending $1 billion on city shelters probably isn't the best way to handle homelessness, and it's certainly not a resilient solution.
And I would just say that I think the homelessness problem is by no means solved in New York. I wouldn't even say it's better than it is in Los Angeles. It's a real crisis here now. And homelessness is the most public and visible manifestation of the severe inequality problem that we have in the United States right now. For years, I think our response was to have a will not to know about it. We turned away. We put people in temporary shelters and did very little. But my view is that the only real solution to this problem is to invest in long-term housing for people who are not able to make it for themselves in the market, and to also invest in the kinds of city services that places like New York have been famous for, but which are always difficult to support financially, especially in difficult times. We have abandoned the poorest people in our cities for far too long, and it's inevitable that problems like homelessness would show up given that treatment.
We're unfortunately out of time, but gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation.